Today, we're talking about something pretty cool. How large language models can flexibly reshape how they understand concepts. Turns out, these models don't just stick to what they've learned during pre-training. Instead, they can actually adapt on the fly, changing their internal representations based on in-context examples. To explore this, the researchers introduce a unique graph tracing task, a clever way to study how LLMs dynamically adjust and rethink meanings. It's an interesting look at how these models mimic human-like flexibility and understanding. Let's dive in!
Let's start by looking at how the authors address a key question. How do large language models handle meaning when the context changes? They point out that these models pick up relationships between concepts during pre-training. But what if we suddenly switch the roles of those concepts during a new task? Can the model adjust the way it internally represents them? They explore this by drawing on the idea of conceptual role semantics. Essentially, they build a graph-based task. Nodes represent concepts like apple or bird, and connections show how these concepts might interact, like placing them on a grid. Then, they vary the context in training and observe if the model reorganizes its representations. The central question is whether these models learn to track semantic roles differently when we shuffle their playground. Give that a moment to sink in before we check out the next part. Alright, continuing our discussion. The introduction talks about how large language models typically organize their knowledge around the patterns in their training data. They form representations for concepts like fruit or animal, based on how those concepts usually appear. But what if the model encounters a concept in an unusual role? For instance, what if strawberry is suddenly presented as some sort of product instead of a fruit? The authors want to test if the model can adjust its internal understanding when given new, in-context instructions. Their plan is to show it context-specific examples and see if the model will pick up new semantic roles. It's like giving the model some evidence that, for this task, strawberry isn't a fruit anymore, and then seeing if it rewrites its concept representation. That sets the stage for the rest of the paper. Now, let's look at the experiment the authors design. They place concepts such as apple or bird on a grid, a blank slate grid that doesn't mirror real-world relationships. Then they generate random sequences that trace a path through this grid and feed them into a language model. Here's the fun part. If you check out the figures they provide, you'll notice that, with enough context, the model's internal representations start lining up with the grid's layout. It forms clusters or groupings that match the grid. This suggests that large language models can reorganize their internal mental maps in response to structured context, adapting to new relationships even if they're completely artificial. To dig deeper, the authors look at what happens when you increase the amount of context the model sees. They find that the more context you give, the more the model's representations realign themselves to match the underlying graph structure. In other words, the model updates its semantics to fit whatever structure it's given. This phenomenon parallels ideas in cognitive science, where context shapes meaning. They highlight 3 contributions. First, they use a graph navigation task to see how models figure out new meanings from structured connectivity. Second, they observe an interesting effect. As more context is provided, the model spontaneously reorganizes its representations. This reminds them of how humans might shift their understanding with new information. Third, they introduce a quantitative way to measure this reorganization using energy minimization. They show how the model's internal changes can be understood by analyzing whether it's making its representations align more closely with the graph. Next, they switch from a grid to a ring-like structure. Imagine concepts like apple and banana arranged in a circular order, paired together to form sequences. These sequences are then fed into the model to see how it adapts. If you look at the figures for this ring setup, you'll notice that as context length goes up, the model's internal representation starts reflecting that circular structure. Early on, the representations might look scattered, but later layers line up in a pattern that matches the ring's connectivity. This suggests that even for entirely artificial relations, like banana and carrot being neighbors on a ring, the model can adjust its representations in a systematic way. Here's how they formally test these new arrangements. The authors call their task in-context graph tracing. They place known concepts, like apple or sand, on artificially defined graphs, grids, rings, etc. graphs that don't reflect real connections. Then they produce random walks along these graphs, generating token sequences. The question is, does the model change its internal mappings to mirror these made-up structures? The chosen concepts are definitely familiar to the model from pre-training, but the authors want to see if the model can override that familiarity with the brand new relationships in the graphs. It's a nice way to see how flexible the model's representations can be. They also mention that similar methods appear in reinforcement learning research, where agents learn to navigate novel environments. So how do the authors keep track of these internal changes? They feed the model sequences generated from each graph grid, ring, and so on. And at every step, they calculate the mean activations for each token. Then they use principal component analysis, PCA, to project these activations into a lower dimensional space. This projection helps us visualize which tokens cluster together in the model's mind. They find something neat. With enough input examples, the model's internal representations start to resemble the graph's layout. However, early layers still cling to the model's pre-trained knowledge, so you see more mismatch there. Deeper layers, by contrast, show a clearer imprint of the artificial structure. This highlights how context can override pre-trained semantics, at least in specific layers. They verify this using both numbers and visualization, so feel free to check out those results in their plots. Now, consider how context size influences these representations. The authors notice that once the context is large enough, the model reorganizes all sorts of unrelated concepts into these task-specific shapes. In a grid setup, for instance, nodes near the center might get visited more often, so they end up with stronger representation updates than those on the edges. It's a combination of graph structure and token frequency that shapes the changes. Then, the authors compare the model's old, pre-trained ideas with how it's representing things under the new task. They test this with days of the week arranged in a circle. The model's early layers still group Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in the familiar weekly order. But in deeper layers, you can see it adopting the new structure. Once you give it enough context, the model's outputs actually reflect this new task ordering, overriding its prior knowledge. We're now looking at another illustration of how these competing structures unfold. The authors use the days of the week again. Naturally, there's a ring if you put the days in order. But they also try a star-like connectivity with non-adjacent links. If you take a peek at their PCA plots, you'll see that lower components, or earlier layers, still show the typical weekly ring. But as the context grows, the star structure starts creeping in, especially in higher components. The neat takeaway here is that the original semantic knowledge isn't wiped out. Instead, it's adapted or reinterpreted depending on the task context. So the model keeps its sense of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday being in a weekly loop, but it layers on top the new structure if enough examples nudge it in that direction. To measure how well the model's representations follow a given graph, the authors introduce Dirichlet energy. It's a way to see how aligned the representations are with the graph's edges. If two nodes are connected, the representations should be similar, so the energy is lower. If the model successfully lines things up, the overall energy drops. They generalize this concept to multi-dimensional representations by summing across all dimensions. That means if you see a big energy drop, the model has reorganized itself to fit the graph's shape. It's a quantitative gauge of how context-driven adaptation plays out in the hidden states. Now, the authors look at different graphs, like a square grid, a ring, and a hexagonal lattice, and ask, how do model predictions and Dirichlet energy change as context length increases? If you check out Figure 4, you'll see that with more context, the model's accuracy at predicting valid next steps in the graph goes up, while the energy goes down. That's consistent with the model learning and internalizing the graph structure. They also point out that the energy never hits zero. Why not? Because if it did, that would mean the model is giving everything the same representation, which is a trivial and unhelpful solution. Instead, the model finds a sweet spot where it captures the structure without collapsing everything into a single cluster. This shows it's genuinely adapting, not just memorizing a simple pattern. Here, the authors introduce a measure called rule-following accuracy for these graph tasks. It checks whether the model is correctly predicting the next node in the graph path. As the context gets bigger, accuracy goes up and Dirichlet energy goes down, suggesting the model's internal organization now aligns with the graph. But they ask, could the model just be memorizing each node from the context? They call that idea the memorization solution. If the model were only memorizing, you wouldn't expect the same patterns in representation organization or the same shape of performance gains. Their results show that something more interesting is happening, more akin to real learning than just parroting back what it has seen. So does pure memorization explain the model's performance? The authors look at a ring with 50 nodes and a grid with 25 nodes. If the model were just memorizing, you'd expect a certain pattern. But that doesn't match the actual accuracy trends. Instead, they spot two phases, a slower ramp-up and then a sharp jump in accuracy. If you glance at their plots, you'll see this transition. They fit a piecewise linear model to show there's a clear turning point, a moment when the model's internal reorganization seems to click into place, leading to much better performance. This suggests the model is doing more than recall. It's reconfiguring how it represents the graph's connectivity. Now, why is the model reorganizing representations in this way? The authors propose an energy minimization hypothesis. They argue that, internally, the model tries to adjust its representations to reduce some form of energy that captures how correct the structure is. This ties in with older ideas about optimization in-context learning, where the model effectively tunes itself during inference. They define this energy in terms of how well the model's representations match the graph. As the context grows, energy falls, indicating better alignment. They also mention energy minimizers, which are essentially the model's best-fit configurations for a given task. It's a framework that helps explain why the model transitions from one representational state to another as it sees more data. Moving on, the authors introduce the concept of spectral embeddings to visualize the structure of different graphs in 2 dimensions. If you have a ring graph, its spectral embedding looks like a circle. A grid might appear as a diamond shape. They find these embeddings by minimizing an energy function that matches the graph structure and ensures each dimension is unique, preventing trivial solutions like giving every node the same coordinates. This approach provides a theoretical link between the graph's geometry and the model's internal states. If the model truly aligns with the graph's geometry, you'll see it in these spectral embeddings. It helps confirm that the model isn't just memorizing labels, it's learning the shape or connectivity of the data. Now they connect spectral embeddings to their energy minimization story. They propose an informal theorem. Once the model has aligned its representations with the graph, the first 2 principal components will match the graph's spectral embedding. They test this claim in their experiments, showing that when they do PCA on the model's representations, you can see the ring or grid layout emerge. They also mention that for disconnected graphs, PCA separates the components. That means each disconnected chunk of the graph gets its own local solutions. So if you look at their visualizations, you'll see each subgraph forming a distinct cluster. All of this supports the idea that the model is picking up on the graph structure in a systematic way. At this point, the authors shift to how in-context accuracy grows with context size and the complexity of the graph. They test grids of different scales to see how well the model traces the graphs. What they find is an accuracy curve with 2 phases, initially slow, then suddenly fast. They fit a linear function to pinpoint the transition. And that transition moves around depending on the size of the graph. They notice a power law relationship. Larger graphs push the turning point further out, meaning you need more context to see the same jump in performance. This suggests the model's ability to handle bigger, more complex tasks scales with the amount of context it's given. They also propose a neat hypothesis involving second-order phase transitions. Think of a system that suddenly shifts from a random to an ordered state when you tweak some parameter, like temperature in physics. Here, they link the model's sudden boost in performance to a bond percolation idea from graph theory, where small clusters merge into a larger connected component once enough edges are added. They acknowledge that this analogy isn't perfect, partly due to the limited size of their graphs. But it's an interesting direction. Maybe the model is percolating from scattered representations to a unified structure as context ramps up. It's a compelling angle for future work. Shifting gears, the authors talk about how neural networks represent concepts and how in-context learning has evolved. Sometimes, concepts get encoded in a line, a hierarchy, or even loops, depending on the model and the task. And in these experiments, we see that language models can dynamically form specific patterns on the fly, purely from context. They also look at how models get better with more examples, this many-shot prompting idea. The findings emphasize that providing lots of context can unlock new capabilities in these models. Check out any of their tables or figures on this point. It's pretty straightforward. As the number of shots goes up, so does performance, especially in tasks that need extensive context. In the final stretch, they tie these results back to the broader idea that large language models can adapt to new context-specific meanings, even though their internal structure was shaped during pre-training. Random walk tasks on artificial graphs act like a test bed, revealing how the model optimizes its representations in response to contexts. They link this to energy minimization again. With enough examples, the model bends its internal states to match the structure it's being fed. They also draw parallels to neuroscience research, where humans can learn new graph-like environments. The overlap might hint at shared principles for how we, and these models, dynamically form representations in our heads when confronted with new tasks. Finally, the authors reflect on the limitations and possible next steps. They point out that PCA is a handy tool for visualizing high-dimensional data, but it can be misleading if taken too literally. Also, we still don't fully grasp the causal links between these visualized representations and the model's predictions. How exactly do those layers shift from old semantic knowledge to new role-based representations? They suggest that more work is needed to nail down these causal relationships and refine methodologies. But overall, their experiments give us a window into the intriguing ways large language models can reorganize their mental models on the fly, simply by seeing more context. And that brings us to the close of this deep dive. We've explored grids, rings, and more, looking at how large language models adapt their internal maps with increasing context. Thanks for following along.